Hi everybody, it's Courtney and welcome back. Today I'm going to be using the Center Cut Holiday Floral Stamp Set by Simon Says Stamp. And you can see it's sort of kind of a background stamp, but there is that piece in the middle, that circle, and it's two different pieces. So you can use it as two different stamps or one. And we're going to be doing kind of sort of both today. Now the theme for today is interactive cards. I kind of went a little bit off the rails a little bit. My plan was to do a spinner card, and I had that thought all throughout the card until I got to the very end. And once I finished it, I realized this isn't really too interactive, but it is what it is. So I am using my Misty here, and I squirted some Tombow Mono multi glue on the back of a piece of Bristol Smooth cardstock and let that dry. That way it becomes repositionable. And that way I can stamp it more than once. I don't have to worry about it shifting around. I placed that piece circle in the center of the card panel just for placement. Then put the rest of the stamp in there, removed the circle, treated my card panel here with an anti-static tool, and then I can go ahead and stamp out the main image, or the floral image, I should say. I stamped that twice with Versamark ink. I probably could have gotten away with stamping it only once, but it's obviously clear ink, and I wasn't sure if I got the greatest impression the first time. So just to play it safe, I did stamp it twice. Now, obviously, we are going to be heat embossing this. I am using gold embossing powder by Ranger. Now, I typically use a coffee filter to catch any excess embossing powder. The only ones that I have in a container are clear and white because those are the ones I use the most. But usually I just use a coffee filter to catch any of that excess. And that way I can just kind of pour it right back into the jar and I have very little waste. I did have one little area that I had some stray embossing powder, but I didn't want it to be. And I'm just taking a craft knife there just to loosen it up, and then I can just tap away that excess. I let my heat gun heat up for about 30 seconds or so before bringing it to the paper. To me, the Bristol Smooth does warp a little bit more than regular cardstock. So you can see that I kind of move around my embossing tool or my heat tool in the beginning just to kind of get everything started, and then I can go back and melt it. Now with metallic embossing powders and a lot of embossing powders, when you're working with a large area like this, sometimes we miss areas. What I like to do is I kind of just turn this around, flip it around a little bit, and any areas that aren't shiny, I know that they aren't completely heat set. So once that is done, we are going to be using my Zig Real Brush clean color markers, whatever you want to call them, whatever those names are. And I'm not going to show you all of this because it's pretty repetitive, but I did want to show you how I do this and the color combinations that I used. So for some of these leaves, I'm going to be using two different greens, and I'm going to just add my darkest areas. I'm leaving a lot of white space here, but I'm blending that out a little bit with a lighter green. Then I can come in with a paintbrush. Now you can use a water brush here. I prefer a paintbrush just because I feel like I have a little bit more control with the amount of water I'm adding. You can see I'm dabbing that off on a paper towel because I'm not adding much water at all. It's damp. And if you can see a small sheen, like a tiny sheen of water on your paper, that's good. That's all the water that you need. So I blended that out a little bit with that water. And for the poinsettia, whatever, however you say it. You guys know I have that New York accent. For the centers, I'm just using a yellow. I'm not going to bother to blend it out. I'm just filling that in solid. But I will use two different reds for the actual leaves. And I'm going to do very similar to what I did with the green leaf. So I'm going to go in with that darkest red, add my darkest areas, and I'm also going to add a little bit of shape to it where it's kind of indented in, kind of like we did, I think it was day 2 or 3, I don't know, when we colored the poinsettias with Copic markers. So again, I'm going to go in with that very damp paintbrush. I'm going to start off in my white areas. So the areas that I did not add any pigment at all, get that area a little bit damp, and then I can bring that paintbrush down to the areas that I added the pigment. Now we have an embossed line here, so it's going to kind of act as a barrier, which is good because I'm not so great with these. So it helps me kind of stay in the lines, but I'm still going to work in different areas that aren't touching. While that one petal is still wet, I'm going to kind of skip around to a different petal that is nowhere near it. That way, in case my two areas touch or my paintbrush slips or something like that, they're not going to blend in with one another, even though we do have that little barrier from the embossed area. Now for the other leaves, there is little holly leaves, and then there's other like this little sprig type area. I'm going to use a completely different green. Now these are smaller, so I'm only going to use one color here, but I'm going to do everything the same way. I'm just going to add a little bit of that pigment down towards the base of each of these leaves, and then go in with that damp paintbrush and work from the tip of the leaf. So I'm going to always start with my clean, damp paintbrush in the areas where there is no pigment and bring that down towards the pigment and just kind of let it spread out on its own. Now there are little holly berries throughout here, and like I said, these are tiny areas, just kind of like the center of the flowers. So I am just going to go in with the darker red that I used for the flowers and just fill those in. Now you want to be very careful with this. The zigs have a pretty fine tip, so they're a little bit easier to get into those smaller areas, but you just want to be super careful because once you add red to areas, no matter if it's water reactive or not, it's pretty hard to get that away. So I went ahead and colored the entire thing, and you can see that some of my petals didn't really have too much of a highlight. So I'm going to add that back in by just going in with a wet paintbrush, add a little bit of water to the tip, and then take a paper towel, dab that straight up and down. I'm not rubbing it, just dab it straight up and down just to kind of increase that highlight area. So now we are going to work on the center, and this is the part that was going to be the spinner part of the card, but you'll see how I changed my mind. So I'm taking another piece of the Bristol Smooth, and that's only because I want to use the same cardstock throughout the entire card. And I am going to once again treat that with my anti-static tool, stamp this twice because these were going to be glued back to back, stamping that with the Versamark ink, and once again heat setting that with my embossing powder. Now once I sprinkled on the embossing powder, I realized that I probably pressed a little bit too hard on my Misty, and I have a big smudge of embossing powder there. I'm not going to restamp these, so I'm just going to take a dry paintbrush and kind of swoop that away, and any little tiny specks that I have left, I can kind of just loosen them up. You don't have to necessarily sweep them away. You just have to loosen them up from the Versamark that we left behind, and then you can kind of just tap your cardstock down onto your work surface or just blow it away. Then I'm going to go ahead and heat set this. Now there are a couple of dots on this top circle here, the one that I'm heat embossing now, that I didn't really get a great impression with the Versamark, so that the embossing powder didn't really stick to that area too well. And they are just the dots that are around the circle. So I'm not going to re-stamp this. I am just going to take a gold gel pen and just fill in those dots, and you're never going to know the difference. So next we can start assembling the card. I'm going to take a stitched circle die that fits, or closely fits anyway. I think there's a die that matches this, but I didn't buy it, so I'm just using one from my stash. Gonna line that up on both of these pieces, stick that down with some Post-it note tape so it doesn't shift around, and run that through my Gemini. And like I said, these were going to be glued back to back, so to create that spinner. So next I'm taking my main panel. I am going to take a large stitched rectangle die for my border, and this time I'm taking a larger stitched circle die and fitting that right in the center. This one's just a little bit larger than the other one. That way it would actually spin had I actually made a spinner card. So next we can, this is where I changed my mind. This is where I started to change my mind, because once I took this out of the die, I really loved the border that it gave with just a little bit of those images showing. So I decided to kind of go with it. And this is typically what I do when I'm making cards. I kind of just go with the flow. I may have an idea in my mind, but very rarely will it actually end up that way. So I'm going to take my panel and line that up on a card base. I'm going to take that same die that I used to cut out that circle, and I'm going to fit it right into that space. And it's going to fit just like a puzzle piece. You'll feel it kind of fit perfectly in there. Again, tape that down with some Post-it note tape. Make sure that you open your card base before you run that through your Gemini, and this will create the opening on my card. So I'm going to add some adhesive to the inside of that circle, which I should have probably just glued down the larger circle first, but I didn't. Line that up so that it looks like a seamless image, and then adhere my piece circle there. Then I can adhere the main circle or the larger circle right directly inside the opening of the card base and that card panel, just making sure that that image kind of continuously is one image. You know, the lines match up, if that makes sense. So you can see that it will open and close, and that piece will be on the inside and the outside. So I wanted to create a little bit of a border to kind of bring out some of this gold. So once again, I'm going to take another piece of the Bristol Smooth. You can use regular cardstock for this. And I'm just going to trim that down a little bit so that it's a little bit smaller than my card base, but still a little bit larger than the card panel. I'm going to just smush some of this Versamark ink right on the edges. I don't need to go too far in because there's really not going to be much of this showing. Then once again, I can sprinkle on that gold embossing powder. I didn't use my anti-static tool because you really don't need it. We don't care if there's any stray embossing powder anywhere because it's all going to be covered up. So once again, I made sure that my heat gun was heated up and heat set this. Now you can add multiple layers. If you have a lot of this showing, I would definitely add maybe another layer of embossing so that you don't get those bumpy areas. But being this is just going to be a very, very small border on my card, I really wasn't too concerned with it. Now, obviously, I need to create a opening in this one as well to match up the openings of the other one. Now, when I ran this through my Gemini the first time, being I have that Tombow Mono multi-glue on the back of it, it really pressed it down. So it was a little bit difficult to get up, but without ripping my card base, which I did a little bit, but it's going to be covered. Nobody will see it. And I'm going to line up this circle die once again, just like that puzzle piece, stick that down with some Post-it note tape and run that through my Gemini one more time. So we already have this panel kind of stuck. It's not permanent, but it's pretty stuck on there to that embossed background or that embossed mat. So I'm just going to lift up the corners, add a little bit more glue to make it permanent, because once you stick, when you use the Tombow Mono multi-glue, if it's wet and you stick paper to paper, it will become permanent. If it's dry, it is temporary. So finally, I can adhere this panel down to the top of my card base there, and I did have to use my sand eraser. I had a few smudges on that circle in the center, but just use very light pressure. You can go over it several times, but you just don't want to press too hard with the sand eraser. But that is it. Not too interactive. Kind of changed my mind a few times, but I guess it's a little bit interactive for what I typically make anyway. So that is it. That is the card for today. Today I am collaborating with Jen, who is actually making an interactive card, much more interactive than mine. And I will link her channel below. Make sure you guys go check out her video. And as always, I will leave the supplies also listed in the description box below. And I'll see you guys tomorrow. Bye.